Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Janet Archer. I'm the Director of Festivals, Cultural and City Events at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm going to be your host for this evening. So a few thanks before we begin. Thank you to everyone at the university who's helped make this series happen, especially the Festival, Cultural and City Events team. And a special thank you to the artists, creatives, academics and cultural leaders who are contributing as panelists across the series. We've had a terrific response to the series, and I want to thank the incredible mix of people who've agreed to take part. I'm enjoying talking to everyone as the series progresses. Thank you too to the Edinburgh Futures Institute, who are our partners for this event. EFI is all about bringing people together to solve global challenges and build a sustainable future. Vitally important before COVID, but even more essential now. And thank you to Donna Jewell and Greg Colloon from Just Sign, who've joined us for the whole series as our BSL interpreters. The series is taking place against the backdrop of the world's biggest festival city, successful because of its extraordinary community of festivals, large and small. 2020 is the first year since 1947 that the spring and summer festivals haven't been able to take place. It feels really important to mark this moment and capture how the arts and creative sectors can help society recover from the effects of COVID-19. We talk a lot about the cost of the arts, but we don't always talk about their value. Edinburgh Culture Conversations is charting cultural value, social value and economic value from the perspective of many different types of people engaged in academic study and arts practice. Today's event is taking place in a week when the city is normally packed full of visitors enjoying Edinburgh's festivals. This year, people from around the world are engaging in a different way through an impressive range of online programs. It's been good to see new digital programs being announced, both from the perspective that this is created work and because the programs are really exciting. If you're in the UK and you haven't watched it yet, catch up with BBC Scotland's Edinburgh 2020 My Light Shines On. It's available on BBC iPlayer, and it celebrates Edinburgh as a festival city and previews new work available to watch on the Edinburgh International Festival site. There's also a great programme of work available on the Fringe Society and Edinburgh Art Festival's websites, and the book festival is coming up soon. But despite all of this, I heard the phrase this week that Edinburgh is like a winter without Christmas. And while it's good to see the explosion in online content without live events and crucially income from ticket sales, the arts and cultural sector has been impacted profoundly by coronavirus in Edinburgh and across the world. And this has also had a significant knock-on effect on the tourism and hospitality sectors. So the subject that we're going to be discussing today is how can the creative industries impact on our changing world? The creative industries were positioned as providing 1 in 11 jobs in 2019. How hard have they been hit over past months compared to other industries? And has their triple bottom line value, cultural, social and economic, been recognised during this period? And importantly, what could we do differently to build back better in the future as part of a sustainable future? So before we begin, I want to ask you to save your questions until about halfway through. I'll do my best to take as many as possible, but I'm sure I won't get them all in. So please do forgive me if we don't manage to answer your questions. To ask a question, use the Zoom Q&A function. You'll find it at the bottom of your screen. We're recording the event, so please take that into account in answering questions. And if you want to tweet, use the hashtag UOE Culture Conversations. That's UOE Culture Conversations. And finally, be aware that the university's approach to ethics means that we're guided by the principles of dignity, respect for others, integrity, objectivity, and openness. I'd like to ask you to present questions in this context, and we will reserve the right to remove questions if they don't fit within this. So I'd like to introduce my guests for this evening, and I'm going to ask each of them to say a few words about themselves. And I'm going to start with Joanna Baker. Joanna, welcome.
Thank you, Janet. Welcome, everybody. Good evening. It's a huge pleasure to be here. My name's Joanna Baker. I have worked in and around the festivals and performing arts more generally for all of my career. Most recently for the Edinburgh International Festival, from which I stood down at the end of 2018 after 27 years. So, and the last 12 or so as managing director. Prior to that, I worked with large-scale touring companies, ballet, opera, and dance. And I'm currently working as an independent consultant, and I'm also chairing a new body called the National Partnership for Culture, which is an advisory group on culture to the Scottish Government that's come out of the Scottish Government's recently published culture strategy.
Thank you, Joanna. I'm going to move us on to Simon Brault, who has joined us from Canada today.
Hello, everybody. I'm Simon Brault. I'm the Director and CEO of the Canada Council for the Arts. I've been in that position since 6 years now. Before that, I spent 30 years at the National Theatre School of Canada in Montreal. And I'm very, very pleased to be part of this conversation.
Thank you, Simon. And we're moving in alphabetical order by surname. So next on the list is Professor Giorgio Fazio, who's here with us from Newcastle University.
Hi, Joanna. Thank you very much for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be present live in this conversation. I'm Professor of Macroeconomics at Newcastle University, as you mentioned, and I'm also part of the Creative Industries Policy Evidence Center, which is a project set up with funding by the HRC under the industrial strategy in order to provide independent research for policy impact in the creative industries.
Thank you. And then moving on to Clive Gilman, who's the...
Yes, hello, hi. Clive Gilman. I work at Creative Scotland in the role of Director of Creative Industries. My background is I studied fine arts. I worked for a long time as an artist, setting up galleries, setting up facilities, and gradually became more interested in running organizations that helped others to make art than making art for myself. I moved to Scotland in 2005 to run Dundee Contemporary Arts in Dundee, and moved to Creative Scotland back in 2015. So I've been in this role for the past 5 years, trying to figure out what we mean when we talk about the creative industries. Thank
you, Clive. It's great to have you with us. And moving on to Candice Jones, Professor Candice Jones from the University of Newcastle. No, from the University of Edinburgh. How did I say that?
Hello, I'm Candice Jones from the University of Edinburgh. I've been here about 5 years. I'm the chair of Global Creative Enterprise in the Strategy Department. And so I'm also on the Policy and Evidence Center along with Giorgio, and also on the Creative Informatics grant for the University of Edinburgh, which is really about data, knowledge, and digital translations for creative sector. And then I'm also heading up the interdisciplinary Edinburgh Futures Institute for the creative industries. So helping develop an interdisciplinary program to train people in the creative industries. So I'm delighted to be here and with such esteemed colleagues.
Thank you. And then last but not least, Sharon Watson.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here in the room. So yes, I'm Sharon Watson. I am 8 weeks appointed as the Chief Exec and the Principal of the Northern School of Contemporary Dance in Leeds. Prior to, I was the Artistic Director of Phoenix Dance Theatre for 11 years. And I think it's fair to say that my career has been steeped in contemporary dance, with the flourish of having the opportunity to work in other areas. I chaired the Leeds 2023 board, which was the organisation we created, which was bidding to become European Capital of Culture, before we had the disaster, and it was a disaster. But still moving forward in terms of the board and working with the Leeds 2023 to deliver in 2023. And just to say that I'm a champion and a political, with a small p, activist in really kind of looking at diversity and championing within the arts the areas that are probably, which are described nowadays as underrepresented.
Thank you, Sharon. So before we move on to this conversation, I just wanted to set the context, and I pulled out some stats which tell a pretty grim story in relation to the situation in the UK. And I'm sure, Simon, if we amplify this on a global basis, we're looking at a very stark picture in relation to the situation for culture and the creative industries right now. But in the UK, new research from Oxford economics projects published by the Creative Industries Federation say a combined revenue drop of 77 billion for the UK's creative industries is predicted for 2020. So that's 1.5 billion a week, with a GVA drop of 29 billion. That's 409,000, 1 in 5 creative jobs expected to be lost. That's more than 9 times the entire workforce of British Airways, or almost triple the workforce of Asda, the supermarket in the UK. The UK's creative sector was previously growing at 5 times the rate of the wider economy, employing over 2 million people and contributing 101.7 billion to the economy, more than the automotive, aerospace, life sciences and oil and gas industries combined. So that presents a pretty stark picture in terms of the challenges that we're facing. Clearly, the cultural sector and the creative industries are not alone in that in relation to coronavirus, and many are feeling the impact. But I'm going to start with that headline question. What are the critical issues for the arts and creative industries right now? And how do they compare to other industries? And Candice, I'm going to come to you first. And then perhaps move on to Giorgio, and then open the conversation out more widely.
Great. Well, I mean, it clearly is a really devastating moment, and I think a moment that's causing many organizations and many creatives to rethink how they operate and what their market is and what they can actually do in this time. If as we do a comparison, clearly the creative industries, I think, are in a better position than many other industries, such as airlines, travel sector, hosting, because they can actually have the possibility of translating to digital formats and possibly generating revenues from digital formats that can go globally as opposed to face-to-face. And then rethinking the operations around how you actually do face-to-face or live performances in a way that facilitates keeping both audiences and performers safe. So I think one of the really interesting examples right now is the Salzburg Festival, which opted to go ahead and is going on at this moment, and how in fact they decided to bifurcate their audience and their performances into 3 different areas. One is people who could not do social distancing and couldn't wear masks, such as performers together on the stage, performers who could wear masks and but couldn't do social distancing, and then people who could do both social distancing and masks, and then how to reconfigure the audience. So they worked really closely. I think the opportunity here is to work really closely with other experts. So they worked very closely with the ministers, microbiologists, pulmonologists, and health ministers to develop new protocols so that they could actually enact this festival. And so that, I think, is the opportunity, is we really can develop and pull on different kinds of disciplines together to help us address new practices. What they also found is that their audiences fundamentally shifted. Obviously, people from Asia, America, Africa would have to quarantine, so those audiences didn't come anymore. And now the audiences are much more local. They're German and Austrian, and some around Europe. So it's a rethinking of audiences as well. So being able to reach potentially globally with more digital and thinking about strategy and revenue generation through IP rights and different kinds of formats, and then how to cultivate and ensure safety with more local and more kind of face-to-face audiences, I think will be some of the big challenges and potentially opportunities for innovation. With that, I'll stop and let other people join in.
Thank you. And I'm going to follow straight through with Giorgio. Same question. In your view, what are the big ticket issues right now?
Thank you, Janet. Thank you. I think Candice said several other things that were in my mind. Maybe what I would like is we're still probably in a mitigating phase. So there is a first issue about mitigating the impact of this crisis, because the full extent of the crisis is still felt extensively across the sector, as you mentioned from the results of the Oxford Economics report. So the first issue is mitigation. Mitigation is quite important because it is critical to preserve the sector and preserve especially the cultural diversity of the sector. I think there is one fundamental issue. It is important per se. It is also important, of course, because of the economic contribution that the sector gives to the UK economy, which is a contribution that is recognized in the national accounts of the country. So it is a natural contribution. The other issue is something that Candice mentioned, which is the issue of transformation. In a way, so and in this respect, not all subsectors of the creative industries are probably the same, and some of the subsectors were more digital ready, clearly were able to respond differently from, say, live and performing arts or museum and galleries. So the challenges across the creative industries are not the same for all sectors. And finally, there is clearly the issue of being able to reopen, and there is a big question mark, which is beyond what Candice mentioned. How do you reopen? And again, I would echo what she said, that it is important to take into account the work together with scientists, with epidemiologists, to be able to reopen, right? So there is one issue. But I think there is also a big question mark about how long this is going to last, because we are facing a lot of uncertainty. We don't know whether there's going to be a second wave, but a lot of people are convinced that there will be. In many countries, there are already hints of this second waves. So there could be a stop and go situation where things could be more critical before they get better. So I would also like to emphasize something before I stop, which is also the fact that over this period, the creative industries have actually given a very large contribution to the economy, but also to society, and it should be emphasized together with the impact that the industry has seen as a result of COVID. And at the PAC has commissioned, together with the IPO, an online consumption study. And one of the results of this consumption tracker is that people mentioned that engaging with digital content has really helped them to go through the challenges also coming as a result of COVID-19. So I think it is important this is recognized and is also followed up if we move forward in the autumn and there is, for example, a second wave.
Yes, and we're going to come on to that question of value. What is it that the arts and creative industries contribute to society, both in terms of cultural value and social value and economic value? But just sticking with impact right now, Joanna, do you want to come in on that question?
Yes, I think it's very interesting. What are the issues that the really real big ticket issues here? I think there's quite an interesting question, which actually I'm going to ask another question of colleagues at some point, which is, Giorgio just said different parts of the sector have been affected differently, and some much more so than others. And clearly, the performing arts, in particular, all of those bits which are about people gathering together and large and audiences gathering together, are particularly badly affected. I'm wondering whether there are any parts of the creative sector, notwithstanding the creative industries, notwithstanding those desperate stats, Janet, have actually thrived economically. I think actually, as it happens, quite a lot of the sector has thrived in a weird way, because we've all been reinventing and thinking about how we do what we do differently. But, there are, I think, maybe some sectors, particularly actually around the digital side, that have really been doing really very well indeed, and really setting creating a sort of foundation for the future.
And Simon in Canada has a huge track record and reputation for innovating around digital arts and technology. Is that your sense, that there's an aspect of the creative industries which are doing very well?
Yes, in a sense, it's true. There are some segments of the sector who are doing well right now. I think, I mean, the way I see it now is that obviously the pandemic is challenging profoundly the very foundations of the cultural sector, especially the arts sector. And the arts sector is at the heart of the cultural industries. So what we see in my country right now is that the arts sector, especially the performing art, have been, I mean, the biggest challenge in the short term is to avoid the collapse of hundreds of organizations and institutions. The big sector right now, the big challenge right now is to take care of people, of individual artists who are facing a situation where they just cannot work, or the type of work they can find even on digital is not, you know, the remuneration is not there. You know, the way to compensate for the work is still very complicated in Canada. So I think that where we are at this point, here in Canada, it has been 5 months in a confinement or complete or partial confinement. And what I see now is that there's a lot of questions about the future of the sector. And those questions, I can see now that there's a portion of the sector who think that we need to do everything in the world to go back to where we were before the pandemic. And there's another big portion of the sector who says they don't want to go back where we were before the pandemic, because before the pandemic, there were a lot of issues in terms of, yes, there's a lot of jobs in the cultural sector, but a lot of them are not well paid, a lot of insecurity, a lot of a lack of diversity. So I think that we are a moment right now where we kind of need to rebuild our sector. And the question is, what will be the values we will put forward in order to rebuild it, to make it more resilient, to make it more relevant for the entire society, and to make sure that the future will be much more inclusive and much more progressist than what it was before the pandemic. So it's an interesting moment where we're looking for short-term solutions, but in fact, most of the answers we're looking for are more mid and long-term in terms of where do we go from now. And it's probably the first time in my country since World War II, where people are going back to the very fundamental questions about why do we need culture? Why do we need the cultural sector? What are the values that we should put forward? And how do we reinvent the cultural policies in order to make sure that we will solve or address problems that are still persistent after 60 or 70 years of public investment in the arts and in the cultural sector.
Thank you, Simon. And Clive, bringing you in, is that a conversation that's also reflected in relation to your day-to-day?
Yeah, very, very much. I mean, we've obviously been in a similar kind of mode to what Simon was discussing there, and just in terms of meeting quite immediate needs, just being involved in shipping quite a lot of money out of the door to try and address where we can, anyway, in a structured way, needs that are most urgent. I think Candice was, Joanna was talking about the performing arts and the issues that exist there, and the recognition that the need to sell tickets for large amounts of people is not going to happen for a while, and so therefore the ability to trade effectively is just not going to happen, and then that takes out a whole tier of infrastructure and support systems around that as well. So I think just trying to address that is the very immediate need that a lot of us are engaged with, but obviously think in doing that, one is constantly trying to think about what the new normal is going to look like. And I think I'm the first person that said the new normal, but it's a term that obviously seems to be floating around at the moment. What is that actually going to look like? And do we want it to be the same as the old normal? And there's a kind of an inevitability that normals tend to assert themselves. So in order to try and define a new normal, we have to think quite hard about what that might be and how we can take people on that journey. And I think it's probably fair to say that there hasn't been the space to really apply that thinking yet, because so much of it is just about the urgency of need at the moment. But it would be wrong to go through this whole process and come out the other side with at least not having reflected upon what the future needs to look like based on the experiences that we've currently been through.
Thank you. And my next question, well, I suppose relates to the fact that we've got people in this room who bring a very international perspective into the conversation from different angles, and the fact that the cultural sector and the creative industries are very joined up on a global level, and the fact that we have an expert in macroeconomics with us this evening. So I'm interested in how joined up you feel cultural policy should be. And Simon, you're the chair of IFICA, an International Association of Arts and Cultural Councils. How joined up does policy need to be? And is it possible in today's world where trade between countries, the rules for trade between countries are changing as we speak? How do we reconcile that tension between geopolitics and geoeconomics, and the fact that we operate within a sector which is reliant on fruitful and positive trading relationships between different countries and continents? Who would like to take that question first? Giorgio, I'll come back to you.
Thank you. It's a very difficult question, so I'll try to do my best. You're absolutely right in terms of the importance of trading relationships, but also international policy coordination in the present times. A pandemic means that it's something of a global scale, and for something as of global scale, you need global solutions. I think it was absolutely evident at the beginning of this when the pandemic hit some countries first. They already needed immediately a collective solution to a problem that wasn't just of a single country. If you think, for example, about the way the tourism sector works and how the tourism sector is linked to the creative industries, you can see how the importance of coordination when it's a matter of addressing people mobility, for example. This is quite evident nowadays with the I mean, you have regional lockdowns, you have international lockdowns, you have restrictions to the movement of people that are being implemented internationally, depending on the epidemiological curves of each country. So it is extremely important that there is international coordination in this respect. And of course, this international coordination, either directly or indirectly, is going to affect the creative industries as well. So that is one element that shows the importance of international policy coordination. But of course, even within the creative industries, you can imagine similar policy coordination. And in a way, I think it is not necessarily different for the creative industries than in any other part of the economy. Now, what we saw at the beginning of this crisis was, for example, a massive restrictions of global value chains, disruption to global value chains and logistics that led eventually to a crisis, for example, in the availability of PPEs internationally. Now, clearly there was a massive trade collapse at the beginning. So the issue is that how do you solve the trade collapse is extremely important. How long this trade collapse is going to last is quite important, because it's then going to lead to less policy coordination eventually, and this is going to affect also the cultural discourse. And internationally, the cultural discourse is sometimes, at least that is my opinion, sometimes very much attached to the national debate and national identity and national culture. So in a way, a lot of the policy interventions are often dictated a lot more by pursuing national culture and national identity, rather than thinking about this, about culture as an international trade, as something that can be tradable in a way. But in order to be tradable, then you need to have the coordination, the trade agreements that you were referring earlier. So it is clearly to show, I think, the importance. Where this is something easy to implement, it is a different question. Again, we are looking at internationally a big movement towards e-commerce, for example. So again, some sectors may be more able to to perform this kind of trade than other sectors, for example. But you know, sectors that traditionally are not very, they don't appear very digital during this crisis have also transformed. So maybe there are opportunities for sectors that traditionally are very analogic to become more digital and also exploit this international channel through e-commerce.
Okay, Simone, I saw you nodding there at one point. I think it was in relation to the fact that policies are often driven by national interests. Do you have a view on this topic?
Yeah, I think what we realize right now is that obviously the pandemic is a global thing, and what we are seeing is that every different countries and responded to the pandemic according to their own politics and their own and who's in power, and there have been a lot of choices that have been made by different countries, different choices in order to face that pandemic. And we see that depending of where the governments are on the political spectrum, it went from, you know, very successful answers to very disastrous answers for the economy and the people. And I think for the cultural sector, the same is true. There are countries who kind of decided that at the very beginning of the crisis that they needed to protect every sector of their economy, including culture. That has been the case in Canada. There are other countries who made different choices, but all in all, what we see now is that in general, the cultural systems and the cultural sectors in the world are deeply damaged. In order to rebuild those sectors, you will need massive investments, both from government and from civil society. And the big question for me now is what will be the rationale at the national level in order to justify those big reinvestment of resources to build the cultural sector? Will it be mostly to answer, as we just said, national needs, or will it be to be able to play a role on the international stage, or is it a combination of two? My view is that you cannot compete globally. You cannot trade, you cannot not compete, but you cannot even participate in the global culture if there's not a bare minimum in terms of what is happening at the level of your own country. And I think that this is why I'm saying right now that we should not take for granted, in many countries in the world, we should not take for granted the arguments or the impact of the former cultural policies in order to restart. I think in many, many countries, we need a new discourse, we need a new positioning, we need refreshed arguments, and we need to bring back much more voices in the cultural sector in order to justify those investments. And because the cultural sector will be one of the last one to recover for very obvious reasons, because of that, it gives us more time to figure this out. But I think that it's a huge work right now to rebuild the trust of governments and the arguments for sustaining and supporting strong cultural sectors. I don't think it's a given. I can see that in many countries in the world, it's quite discouraging to see where things are for the cultural sector.
Yes, and clearly there are many calls on resources right now. Sharon, I can see you nodding in response to Simone there. Do you want to come in on that point?
Yes, really interesting, because I think when our government announced the 1.57 million that was going out to the cultural industries, it was really quite shocking how it was described in terms of where that money would be deployed and how. Well, maybe not so much the how, because we're still waiting for that, but it's quite interesting that the crown jewels in terms of the description of the government's priorities was utilized to kind of tell us that we're going to get our culture moving again, when really what I've experienced is, and I guess this can be also replicated on an international level, the small and hyper local versus the kind of you know, the global stage is a very different place to operate. And I think when we talk about values, we really have got something missing in terms of ignoring what I think the top down and the bottom up scenarios play within our sectors. I mean, for me, within the dance sector, it's horrendous to think that actually what we do have is an understanding of those values. And it's the very thing that's kept us going as a society. I think we have relied on our creative industries to keep our mental health going, to keep ourselves physically going, to keep our mentally creatively going. And yet it's the very thing that I think is missing from the discussions within government. It's the last part of the sector that's going to get the investment that it needs to actually really hold on to the golden thread, which I think is the one thing that we do within the creative industries, is tie things together where perhaps we are innovative, we are creative, we think outside of the box in order to get the economy, to get jobs moving, to get things, to get people back on their feet. And yet it feels as though it's the last thing that we actually have in terms of the offer and the discussions. You're absolutely right to talk about the voices that are not around the table, because I do believe that this is probably where some of the creative thinking is taking place in our localities, with our locals, on our doorsteps. And actually that doesn't seem to extend itself beyond into the rooms of debate, which is a real shame. And just one of the other things I'd like to add to that is that there's something about us kind of looking at how our values around the work that we create and how we deliver and what we do. And we have become a society that is so disposable. And that's really evident in how we are now looking at how we're rebuilding our economy and the values that we have within that, and a number of things that are surrounding that. The disposable way in which we operate within our arts is also something that I think is quite concerning. So, but yeah, global scale and global solutions, but they really can start locally.
Thank you, and a number of points there, and going back to Simon, clearly major decisions are going to need to be made in relation to thinking about how to carve out a way for the future. Do you think that the public value the arts, well, I'll say it, do you think the public value the arts more than politicians? Is there there's some very good statistics now in terms of public engagement in the arts, in the sort of 80% and 90% right across the UK. I imagine in Canada that's reflected as well.
I guess we need to make a difference between what we call with culture as a dimension of the experience of being a citizen, of being a human being. For me, it's clear that the COVID was not a moment where culture was less important. I think that when you look at how people survived the confinement, for instance, it's clear that without culture, it would have been really very difficult. So I think that in terms of artistic creation, in terms of sharing artistic content, in terms of interest towards culture, we are reaching peaks right now. I think where we need to make a difference between what is the cultural sector as a sector of activity. So the professionals, the production, the distribution, the monetization of the work. I mean, there's a disconnect right now between culture as an important value for societies and the cultural sector, the way it is organized and the way it is structured and the way it is financed. And I think our job is to kind of reconcile both. I think we kind of need to capitalize on the fact that people are paying more and more attention to culture. They want it. Everybody, we saw that on the news. I mean, the first thing people did after, having food and medical supply was, making sure that there would be a cultural life. The problem is that what is the contribution right now of the cultural sector as a sector to the cultural life of the society? How essential is it? And how can we make sure that people make a link between those two? I think this divide is more and more obvious. And one of the reasons of that is because the cultural sector is not enough diversified, is not enough dealing with the problems of today, the day-to-day life problems. The institutions are seen as being very expensive and serving an elite. And so I think that we kind of need to look closely at all the disconnects between culture as a reality of life and the cultural sector itself, And we need to kind of reconcile both by doing the wise investments and probably by adjusting cultural policies to put at the heart of our policies democratization, democracy, engagement, representation, inclusion, and values like that. I know it's very far from the discussion about trade, but I think at the end of the day, trade won't work if there's no trust. And this is that trust that the sector needs to rebuild. And I hear right now a lot of big institutions pleading for a bailout because of the impact of the COVID. And those, pleas are not very well received and very well heard, because what people want to hear now is not what are the needs of the cultural sector, but more what does the cultural sector bring to real people in their daily life to going and navigate through new territories in the context of this pandemic.
Yeah, and clearly there's a lot that is now starting to appear, and certainly in the UK, we saw a piece in the Guardian today talking about the huge kind of rallying call from cultural organisations in contributing to communities at this very difficult point in time. There's a real civic response from arts organisations, I think, coming through. Joanna, you have taken on the chair of the National Partnership for Culture on behalf of the Scottish Government, and I guess you're now starting to look at all of these issues with the cohort of representatives around the table and thinking about how to inform future policy as part of that conversation. Does this conversation resonate with some of the things that you've been talking about with your colleagues there?
Yes, absolutely. Of course, a little bit of context. The Partnership for Culture was established before COVID. So it has to be said that the context for that thinking, which was an advisory group, has changed just a touch since the initial concept. But just to loop back on a couple of points raised, completely agree with Simone that that this is a moment, I think, for all of us in the sector where we're sort of really re-examining, sort of for the first time since 1945, 1946, or 1947 in the UK's case, the whole piece of how we support and value culture. And one of the interesting one of the interesting comparisons, I think, between different countries, and this is not quite the trade question, but this is a kind of international question, is the very particular impact that this crisis has had on individuals, freelance workers. And certainly in the UK, the sector is so reliant on freelancers. So we've talked about the big institutions, and we know that the institutions need support, but there's this vast number of people. And what's happened in the UK with cultural policy over quite a long time now is that there have been more and more reliance on freelancers. There's been people, and that's a result of an awful lot of complex issues to do with funding. Whereas you look at a country like France, where you have a very different way of supporting individual artists in particular, possibly not the creative workers, but artists. So I think there's some very, very interesting conversations around that. But just to answer your question directly, Janet, one of the things that we changed immediately with the partnership, and we've only been going about 2 months, so this is quite new, was to, in terms of the remit, was to look at how not only to ensure that the sector, renewal and recovery of the sector, but actually how the sector can play a full part in helping to renew and helping society to build back better, which is one of the phrases that he used here. And there's been some very interesting, now I'm an optimist, I think, so I'll have to tell you, people often tell me I think I'm a little bit of a Pollyanna on some of these subjects, but I think some very interesting things happening in Scotland at the moment. There was recently an advisory group on economic recovery, which apart from anything else, it made my heart sing that it started with a quote, and it started with a quote from if you like, a cultural quote. I think it was an old Scandinavian proverb. I don't know if anybody can, I did note it down actually, yes. Those who wish to sing will always find a song. That was the first opening of a report on economic recovery. But actually that report talked a lot about the Scotland looking focusing on a well-being recovery and this idea of the 4 pillars of capital, which is, not a new concept, it's an interesting one. And culture featured reasonably heavily in that. So the optimist in me says that, and this is maybe responding slightly to Sharon's feeling of despair, that there is at least some parts of the world, and let's hope that we can achieve something of this in Scotland, where understanding that culture is not only can but will and should play a part in recovery, and it's part of that triple bottom line that you talked about earlier, Janet. Social, cultural, as well as economic impacts of culture. It's incredibly important.
Thank you. And I was just going to come on to that. So, Clive, social, cultural, economic, is that the right way to think about value, or are there other things in today's context that we now need to bring into play?
Well, yes, absolutely. We're kind of struggling to understand our society through quite outmoded concepts of how an economy actually functions. And I think recently there's obviously been some quite useful thinking done around that. Understanding that our approach to how we exist within that thing that we call the economy is not purely based on the models that we have been taught over the years around Homo economicus, economic man, and the rational decision-making process. That how we inhabit that world is as much to do with the relationships that we have in that space, the values that we ascribe to those relationships, and the way in which we perform within that space, how we express ourselves and the things that we share. And I'm a big fan of the approach that says that the economy is an anthropological space. It's to do with humans interacting, and that looking to anthropologists like Pierre Bourdieu, who talk about the notion of cultural capital, social capital, and economic capital being the assets that a human holds in order to understand how they function within the world. So scaling that up to a societal level seems incredibly important, because if we continue to operate within a thing that is called the economy, that only views that economy through one lens, we are constantly undermining the status of the humans who inhabit that space. And so therefore we need to build an economy that is reflective of the human values that each of us holds. So therefore that triple bottom line, and there are different ways you can look at it, but that triple bottom line, that reassessment of Bourdieu's capitals is a way to do that. And I'm a fan of that. I know it has its detractors, but for me, it's a way of helping us to better understand when we talk about the economy, that it's not just about money, it's about people's lives. And people live lives in complex ways, and the economy has to recognize that.
Thank you. And I looked up, I was doing a bit of research this afternoon. I found an academic called Ellen Disinayak, who talks about an adjective. She coined the phrase paleoanthropy psychobiological. So looking at paleo as ancient, and antho meaning human or human race, and psycho, the mind's or mental process, and biological of or relating to biology or living organisms, which sort of sits very neatly in relation to what you're saying there, Clive.
Yes, I was going to say, Janet, you'll know I've mentioned this before, but we sometimes talk about the economy in the way that it is a dragon that lives in the woods, and once a year we have to go and sacrifice one of our children to this dragon, like it's something that is completely separate to us. We are the economy, and how we function and the interrelationships that we hold is how the economy actually functions. So we need to reclaim that. We need to bring that back into the human space.
Candice, do you have any perspectives on that you want to bring into play?
Yes, I think we're making a very important and critical point, and I also want to link it back to what Sharon talked about a bit as well, is that the economy is not separate from the social relations. And I think COVID has really raised the whole issue of the destruction of our social relations, because the places that we gathered, the things we did together, where we went to be fed and emotionally supported and psychologically engaged, are often, they're through the arts. And so by taking that away, we've really diminished and sort of impoverished our experience as human beings. So I think we need to talk not only about how the creative industries affect the economy, but how they affect our social relationships to one another, to our cities, to our localities where we live, and the places that we engage with people, and how we would go to the pub to hear music and participate in that, or how we would go see a play or a drama with friends and then be part of the emotional reaction of the audience that gave us a wonderful sense of collectivity. And so I think, you know, the issue then is how do we knit together the local experience of culture, the national experience of culture and priorities, and then also the international, so we can actually have these working more synergistically as opposed to at odds with one another. And part of that, I think, is rethinking that I think Clive hit it absolutely correctly. The economy is relationships, and it is exchange among people, and that exchange can be monetary, it can be empathic, it could be how does it affect our feelings of being a citizen who's willing to fund things because we feel connected to our local and national identities and experience. And so I think, and then also internationally, that we have empathy and want to be connected to and learn from other people around the world.
Thank you. And of course, I'm going to start taking some questions coming through from our audience now. Of course, a successful economy is also conditional on the environment that we're functioning within, and what the environment allows us to achieve because of local and global circumstance. So a question that's come through from Joe Goldblatt says, when evaluating the impacts of cultural events such as the Edinburgh festivals, how do panelists believe that in future years the environmental impacts may be improved to achieve our nation's overall ecological sustainability goals? So big question there in terms of impact. Who would like to have a go at that one? Silence on the other end of the call.
No, I'm happy to go because partly I just did some work with the Edinburgh International Festival precisely about this issue around sustainability, and we were developing some potential solutions for them because, you know, COVID obviously completely disrupted festivals, which very much depend on international participation, both by artists and by audiences. And a core question is at the heart of it is how can you be international and sustainable at the same time because of the ecological issues of travel. And so then how do we engage with participation in a way that reduces our footprint? So, you know, shifting to electric vehicles, for example, to shuttle trains to become electric. They're now working on electric airplanes, which would really radically change the dynamic of the carbon footprint. Obviously, digital facilitates that by being connected with other people if we can create more engaging forums, honestly, for a digital engagement. But those are some of the ways that we can, this COVID is really, I think, sparked a very profound way that we really need to think about that we can't just go back to business as usual. We really need to think about how do we retain participation and engagement in a more global way while reducing our ecological footprint, and then really calculating, like, how do we source foods, how to reduce waste, how to reduce methane, and how do we reduce travel in terms of ecological footprint, and what can be local and engage in that to reduce it as well.
Thank you, Candice. I'm going to move us swiftly on. Clive, I'm going to move on to you. I think I know what your answer will be to this question, but I'll ask it anyway. And I think I know what your answer is because I think Creative Scotland's been very flexible with its funding over this period and allowed people to adapt their use of grants to get through. The question is, how useful would it have been to have an equivalent of an export loan guarantee program that would underwrite cultural activity against cancellation due to the pandemic, which would allow producers and festival directors to proceed with more confidence?
Well, I suppose on some levels that has happened in the sense that with the shutdown, all of the regular funding relationships have been sustained. So everybody has continued to be funded in the way that they would have been funded through this period, so that the opportunity to develop work and Obviously, the circumstances of every particular organisation is going to be different, but the ability, the resources are there to maintain some level of consistency through both the organisations and hopefully future programmes that people will be developing. And that's been picked up with the Performing Arts Fund that's gone out now, which is encouraging people to bring people back from furlough and to support freelancers as well, so that the whole process can begin to open up again. So we've been trying to do that through some of the areas of work. Obviously, both the regular funding and the performing arts is only one part of the sector, and it's certainly not the full extent of the much broader creative industries, but obviously it's one area where we've already, I think, articulated that it's been hard hit and is likely to be hard hit for a while. So it's been one area where we have focused some of that resource. So yeah, I think in some ways, elements of that, if I think I understand the question correctly, are happening at the moment with the resources that we've got available to us.
Thank you, Clive. And I'm going to move on to Sharon, partly because I think dance has started to digitise its practice, particularly in terms of participation, in an incredibly sophisticated way, with dance classes moving online in a way which has been quite incredible. So the question is from the same audience member, Charles Gaskell: are we starting to build up best practice in how to be financially successful within a purely digital world without relying on large corporate entertainment organisations or national bodies? Or are we moving back into an era of reliance on patronage, as there was in the 18th and 19th centuries? So question in two halves there. Do you want to have a go at the first part of it, and then maybe somebody else would like to also respond?
Thank you, Janet. I think it's quite interesting that Clive, you just talked very succinctly about the kind of the support that's out there, and within dance, it's quite interesting that actually we've had to become more resilient and more creative in how we deliver the art form itself. I don't think it's the answer, which is, you know, unfortunately, because we have something succinctly missing from the contact and from the experiences that we have. But it's not to say that that kind of art form, the art form itself, can't embrace a bigger, more opportunist way of working behind the screens, and that does also require a different kind of financial support. I think what concerns me even more than the fact that actually we might want to consider how the dance industry itself is actually working through this challenge are the systems that we have to work through in order to make the changes. And the lens in which, Clive, you mentioned, the lens in which we're viewing and we're seeing and we're operating isn't likely to change very quickly. And for me, that is really problematic, because that only gives us what we've already got. And, you know, one of the questions I think, Janet, is in one of your questions is, what do we leave behind? And I think there's a big question there about what we need to leave behind. And that's some of our systems that doesn't enable us to change. That's some of the decision makers that don't understand how to actually view things through very different lenses, how the world is a global opportunity to see things differently, but yet we still choose to sit back, get back to normal. Well, I don't really think that normal is really part of our success, or will become part of our success. And let's be honest about it, it's actually caused a lot of problems because there are systemic systems that do not allow for change. And as far as I'm concerned, I think one of the things that I really have experienced, and it's massive. We've had one pandemic with COVID, but we've also had Black Lives Matter, and for me, that's been another pandemic. And the pandemic of that is seeing our Black and brown artists really struggle to penetrate any kind of system that would even remotely look at the way in which they operate or how they could operate differently. So the first part of the question, I think, is, you know, we do need both, we really do, but we do need some of those systems to really kind of be unpicked and unplugged. And actually, some of them are just need to be left behind, quite frankly.
And yes, so absolutely, what do we need to stop in order to do things better in the future, I think needs to be asked like a stick of rock through the rest of our series. It's a big question. Simon, you're nodding there.
Yeah, I completely agree with Sharon. I think what we saw in my country is that at the beginning of the pandemic, for the first time probably since ever, the government decided to treat the cultural sector as any other sector. So there were universal, measures that have been put in place. The government casted a very wide social security net in order to provide to millions of Canadians, guaranteed security income during the pandemic, including the artists. So all of a sudden, after having argued for many, many decades that the cultural sector was different, we were blessed that the sector was treated like any other sector. So we spent a lot of time over the last 4 months, even as a public funder, administrating money in order to help the people, the persons, and to go through the crisis. But where we are right now is that we kind of need to say, okay, so now that most of the people stayed into the sector, emergency measures are coming to an end. The government is talking about recovery for all the economic sector. What kind of recovery do we want for the arts sector, and for whom in the sector? Because the people we took care of during the pandemic, the artists we took care of, for some of them, the emergency measure they got, the emergency money they got, was more than what they earn normally when everything is working well. And when you look at, you know, who exactly was earning less before the pandemic than during the pandemic, you realize it's all the indigenous artists, it's all the Black artists, it's all the people of colors, it's all the marginalized artists who don't live in the big cities. So you're saying now, okay, there is a recovery. What do we do with all those people? How do we reorganize things to give them the space that was denied before? And obviously it will produce a different sector. It will mean different choices. It will unplease part of the sector because a lot of people feel entitled to a recovery while others are begging to be part of the recovery. And I think that for the public authorities, and for sure for an organization like the Canada Council, we are now in a point where we will need to demonstrate that what we will do for the recovery has a certain legitimacy in terms of democracy. If we cannot do that, we will be a complete failure, and I think the sector will collapse. Because we are going probably through a period of time that will last probably 3 to 5 years of reconstruction. And if the only project is to reconstruct what it was before, I think it's not interesting. I think the project that we need to have right now is to build a cultural sector that will be in line with the cultural needs and rights of our societies. And if we don't do that, I think it's not worthwhile, all the public investments and all the efforts.
Thank you. Very important point there, I think. So moving on to our questions, we've got a really interesting question coming up. So if science and culture collaboration is an important part of the way forward, what would the agenda for day one of the associated summit meeting or conference look like? So that's from Andrew Ormston. So we are collectively collaborating on putting together a summit which is bringing arts and science together. What will day one look like? Candice, would you like to have a stab at that?
It's a great question and extremely provocative. And I guess one of the first questions I would think is partly, who do we want in the room together? I think that's a very important piece of what this summit would look like. And I would love to hear other people's perspectives as well. But I would think we would need scientists who are amenable, understand, and value culture, and who see the value of culture, and then also artists who want to see different ways of potentially distributing, experiencing, and creating their own artwork. So what can they learn from science and scientists? And then essentially, how do we get these people to talk together? So for example, in terms of scientists, you may think about, if we want to reconnect the social, then one of the key issues, as I talked in my earlier example, is how do we do that in a way that's safe during a pandemic? And is the expectation we're going to have more pandemics, and this is only one in the beginning of more? Well, what does that mean in terms of reconfiguring artist, audience, experience, and interaction? So I think that's a very important question, because especially for live performances and for creating social solidarity and socially shared experiences, we need to be able to address how do we interact together in ways that are safe, in ways that are meaningful, and in ways that enliven the engagement and also safeguard challenges that we can experience. And then what is best put online? How do we create or extend digital experiences so they're more engaging, they feel more real, they feel more emotive, there's faster and social cues and relationships. Those would be some of the things that I think would be really useful in terms of starting conversation. But I would love to hear what other people think as well.
So I'm going to bring Giorgio in. I mean, clearly a lot of work has been done with culture and science. There's a whole theory around well-being and economics, which the New Economics Foundation has been studying for many decades now, I think. What's your view? If you were to bring science and arts together, how would you approach that conversation?
So I think there is longer term issue, the one you're mentioning about well-being, that is coming to the forefront in these times because of the pandemic, clearly. So again, I mentioned the online consumption tracker commissioned by the PEC that clearly shows the value of consumption of digital content for the well-being of people. And again, referring back to the question earlier about the value of culture in society, especially in these difficult times. It also shows other issues that I think are quite important in the context of what was said earlier. So for example, it shows that a lot of people are becoming online content creator. So between 50 and 60 and 56% of people create content online. People are consuming more non-traditional content online, which is what Candice was mentioning. And in a way, I think it is related to what Simon was saying earlier, which is this massive trend. Is there, or actually, as a question, is there a trend towards democratization of culture because of the adoption of technology, for example? And I would like to draw a parallel with the energy sector, where we are moving away from the production of, with traditional means to more decentralized production. So now you have micro production centers, people producing energy in their homes, and a lot of the investment is into the smart grid and how to channel this energy to people who are producing less energy, surplus of energy to people who are in deficit of energy. And I think it's also a question on my side to extend this could be one way forward in terms of making the cultural sector more democratic. Are we moving in this direction? And should the investment be there? How is this related to your question? I think it is related in terms of the issue about inequality and democratization and the social discourse that was mentioned earlier. I mean, the value of culture actually in the economics literature is very well recognized in terms of growth and development. So I think regional scientists, regional economists should really be in the room to discuss more about this role because it's actually very well recognized. You have the debate on the critic class, which is being clearly popularized by Richard Florida, that clearly highlights the importance of the creative class. So if the issue is really that of the value of culture, I think we need to bring these people into the room. If the issue is more about inequality and democracy, I think it's a matter of discussing this issue more deeply. I mean, you have multiple issues here. The issue of diversity has been mentioned clearly, is extremely important. You have the issue about digital access, for example. If you're moving towards more digital content, it is critical that in this next wave, there is a real democracy in terms of access, digital access and digitalization. I think it is the investment in this direction should be really, really important. And finally, I think it's epidemiologists that are really important. And many factories in continental Europe are reopening, hiring epidemiologists to see how they can streamline the production in a safe way, in a socially distanced safe way, to reassure workers, for example. So again, that is probably a type of scientist I would like to see in the room. And I'll stop here because I think over.
Yes, and of course, in all of that, there's a very big question about who makes the money. So if everybody is becoming a content creator, and if we're utilizing online platforms, commercial online platforms, increasingly in order to be able to communicate and interact with one another, but the originators of that content are not necessarily benefiting directly themselves, there's a problem in all of this. So I suppose a very big question, which I'm not going to try and get you to answer today, because I think we've got it coming. I know we've got it coming up in future panels. Is there a way that one could readjust in order to draw in more cash to benefit the cultural sector through online activity?
Sorry, you probably need also lawyers then to discuss IP.
Exactly, indeed. But instead, I'm going to move us on to our next question, which is from Sandra Richardson. So is there an opportunity to tap into alternate needs which the government ought to address, such as the challenges facing the country in terms of mental illness? Joanna, the cultural strategy is effectively looking at how culture can be embedded into many different areas of public policy. Is this something that is coming up in your discussions, and how could we find a way of bringing together different types of policymakers to be able to talk about the value that culture offers in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. Not only could we, but we must. I think what's very interesting about the cultural strategy, as you say, Janet, is that it actually took quite a long time to be developed. It had a rather long gestation, but it did appear just before COVID. But in a way, its emphasis on this, if you like, this cross-policy agenda, the importance of culture in terms of health, in terms of well-being, in terms of social cohesion, in terms of education, that is threaded throughout. That strategy came about with conversations with people in the sector. And, you know, we all know this, all of us who work in the cultural sector, it's what we do. We care passionately about the impact we have across society. And in some ways that, of course, that feels even more pertinent and relevant and important right now. So I think that in some ways, you know, nobody's disagreeing. I mean, the economic advisory report that I mentioned earlier says the same thing. It actually says the culture sector is a very high priority for support in recovery. It's it's an essential element of well-being and the country's well-being. You know, all of those things are stated, and I think are believed. The challenges are actually how you do that in reality, because we still work in a really quite a siloed way. You know, how do you encourage government and others to break across those silos, to think beyond how I'm going to deliver my education policy or my health policy, and actually look at how culture can integrate across all of those different policy areas. I mean, it's a fascinating and important discussion. I believe that it's one that's the time has completely come to have it, and I hope that in the way that sometimes good things can come out of terrible circumstances, that the position we find ourselves in might actually accelerate that discussion. And I don't want to sound too kind of over-optimistic here, because I think there are also massive challenges. Equally, the times we find ourselves in make it, I believe, even more important that we consider and really think properly about these issues of diversity and access and gender, because those could all get lost in this major the challenges we have in just recovery and moving forward. One thing that I had a very interesting discussion with somebody last week when I was being just a little bit too optimistic and said, well, one of the interesting things at the moment in the cultural sector is that as Clive mentioned, lots of cultural organisations are receiving part of the sector anyway, the subsidised sector, are receiving support, and they actually can't put on great big performances, and they're not really focused on generating income because they can't do that at the moment, ticket sales, etc. So there's an opportunity for them to do different kinds of projects, to really work in different ways, to maybe start thinking about how they're reaching different audiences. And the person I was speaking to said, yes, but that mustn't be at the expense of those organizations, those grassroots organizations who are already doing that work and doing it really, really well. And, you know, having the big players move in just because they can and they have the opportunity right now isn't necessarily a very helpful thing to do. So this goes straight back to Sharon's point of view about actually how we really tap into the good grassroots activity, or just activity that's coming out of the community and out of the sector and out of different practitioners.
And we've talked about freelancers earlier, and I suppose I'm interested too in what you think individuals can contribute at this particular point in time, and then marrying that up against, in order to create space for those individuals to be able to do more, are there things, going back to the question of what do we need to give up in order to move forwards, what are those things that we'll need to stop doing in order to generate more opportunity for individuals in the future? But Sharon, you wanted to come in on that point.
Yeah, on the back of what Joanne was just was saying, I think there's I kind of, perhaps I may be simplifying things a little bit too much in my world, and there's a cause and effect. And I think at the moment, COVID has presented us with an opportunity where we've all had to step back from our activities. Every human has had to step back, and we've all had to reevaluate. And I think what's really very interesting is, you know, we talk about needing more policies. We've had these policies. We've had policies, we've had the debates, we've had the discussions. And actually, I kind of do wonder, the frustration for me is, if we continue to just say that that's what we need, then how do we make the impactful change? How do we get to the grassroots when our bigger organizations are talking about, well, these are areas of work that we've not ordinarily done in the past. And now actually what you've got is an opportunity. Yes, you're actually, maybe you need re-educating in how you operate with grassroots, because you haven't really tampered in that space before. And our freelancers that live in that space, that work in that space, are the people that you need to communicate with, because they have been doing it. They are making a difference. They are making a change. And I just wonder that we can talk ourselves out of and put ourselves into a very comfortable space where we can satisfy the need to do exactly what we've done. So let's build another policy that holds nobody accountable, that isn't checked and hasn't got any balances on it, because it's easy enough for us to do that. So when we step into a room, who is doing the checking and the balancing, and who is calling it to account? Because that's where I need to be able to kind of say, actually, this isn't happening. This is not going to make change, because, you know, there is a leveling up, there is a deficit in terms of our social classes that has actually not been addressed in a way that I think this is the moment. And if our governments really do want to make change, this is now. They're going to miss the boat. And actually all we're going to do is unfortunately, another 10 years, 15 years, 40 years from now, this conversation will be happening with another set of people around the table. So, you know, there's something about there is a simplistic way to do it, is not to consider that the bigger organizations can carry on doing what they're doing. And to some degree, those bigger organizations need to understand it's not about what they've always done. So let us help you talk. Let's get around the table and help you talk about what can be different, what it's going to look like, because it won't look like the same thing that you did last year. And you know, those conversations are real, and they have to happen if we're actually going to make an impact. And let's not get selfish about how we need to operate right now. We've got a world, we've got a society to save. And if we don't really look at our cultural impact, the cause and effect, we took sports out of the curriculum, and now we know we've got young children that are obese. We take music out of the curriculum, and we're now having private lessons to develop our music industry. It's pretty obvious. It really isn't rocket science. We had the dinner, the example of the footballer talking about school meals. We need to look at some of these things which perhaps are embarrassing, perhaps are not things that people want to talk about, but those are where the changes need to take place right now. And I'm afraid some people will have to relinquish to gain. And I think it's our society that will gain. We relinquish what we've already had.
Thank you, Sharon.
It's not difficult.
We've got two hands up. Clive, and then Simon. And I hope that Gita Upadhyaya, who's asked a question, will feel that we're answering it without even raising it. I think we're starting to respond to it. Clive.
Yeah, just a quick response actually. It's partly to what Sharon was saying, but also back to Andrew's question, because I think one of the things that we're often in danger of doing in this sector is we assume that there's a kind of moral purpose to culture, and culture is nasty and brutish and selfish and all those other things. And we actually have to work quite hard to give it a moral purpose, which actually sustains the things that we think are significant within that culture. And that means we have to work hard at it, and we can't assume that just because we like doing it, that it actually has a moral purpose, that it is actually improving our society. We have to challenge ourselves in order to make sure that if we think there is an ethical purpose that we want to achieve through it, that we actually make that ethical purpose visible, and we work to achieve it. And I think there's a danger that we all too often will fall back into the assumption that culture has its own purpose. Yeah, culture exists, but actually if we want to improve the society that we live in, we actually have to make that culture work quite hard for us to actually achieve that. One of the things that I'm quite taken by is we often make assumptions around the relationship between culture and mental health. And Daniel Kahneman, who's one of the world-leading psychologists who's sort of developed some of the concepts around happiness and happiness indexes, talks about how the cultural sector is one of the areas of practice that produces the most dissatisfaction amongst people, because actually the gap between your aspirations and your achievements are often the greatest. So we have to be quite careful about this, which is why I think, going back to Andrew's question about the link between science and culture, is that we can learn a lot from science around how we actually interrogate the moral and the ethical purpose of what it is we're trying to achieve through our practice, and make sure that that is visible and that it is foregrounded within what we do.
Thank you, Clive. And that's a beautiful segue into introducing next week's event, which is looking at how the arts affect societal and cultural behaviours, and why does creativity matter not just to the arts, but to our whole existence as human beings. And again, we've got a great panel joining us next week on Monday at 6, if you would like to join us. So moving on to Simon, we've got 8 minutes left for this conversation, and things are getting fiery. So let's roll forwards.
Yes, thank you. I just want to say that I think that we are living a moment where things are quite disorganized. I don't think that, it will take some time before there will be some kind of a normality in the way people interact because of this COVID. We have to learn how to live with it, probably more than hoping that it will be over in the next few months. So I think that in this time, there's a lot of space for innovation right now. It's true what Clive mentioned is true. In my country, we are now paying, the grants to all those organizations who can simply not do their regular work. So what we are doing is we are inviting them to innovate. I feel that all over the world, the cultural sector right now is kind of a vast laboratory where we need to try different things and reach different people. I can see right now that some presenters who have their marketing and programming and all their work is done normally for 10,000 patrons at the most every year, is now through internet. Their mission now is to reach, hundreds of thousands of people. So I feel that there's a lot of possibility of exploring and innovating. But what I want to say is that the most important decision we can make right now is to allow new people to come under the tent. We just did at the Canada Council a huge project called Digital Original. And the idea was to offer grants, small grants, to thousands of artists, and a lot of them never applied to the Canada Council before. But they got support during this crisis, and we see amazing work coming from people who we would not even listen to before. I feel that this, at the Canada Council over the last 5 years, we had the doubling of our budget, but we said at the very beginning that at least 25% of all the new money should go to people who never got a grant before. Because we feel that if you only listen to the people who were already in the system, who knew before how to navigate this system, and you define the future with them, the future will look like a lot like the past. What I think is that the future needs to look like the future. So we need to make sure that right now we use some of our resources to open our frontiers, to open, to multiply the number of entry points into our systems, to make sure that people who were not heard, people who need the most right now, the power of the cultural system to express who they are and what they want and what kind of future they want, that these people can access it. And if we don't do that, if we don't take advantage of this period to open up our systems, again, I'm not very optimist, but I see that everywhere it's done, the benefits and the incredible, addition of creativity and energy is happening. And this is why I remain optimist, but we need to open up.
Thank you, Simon. And you slipped a line in there, doubling of our grants, which is a tremendous achievement, which I think you have played a huge part in Canada. What was the argument that you made that enabled you to be successful?
I think the argument was that we would not do more of the same. That was, just to make it very simple, I think that any argument about public investment in the arts, which is at the end of the day trying to do more of the same, will not work, will not be heard. We made the argument that if we would get new money, we would do something different. We would be much more inclusive. We would open to diversity. We would go where we were not before. We would not just answering the needs of the lobbies in the sector, but really build something different. And I think this is what we are doing. And again, it's not easy, because it's always easier to be supported by the voices of people who are already in the system than to get support from people who don't even know that your system exists. So for me, the main argument and the main opportunity we have right now worldwide is really to rebuild an art system, a cultural industries that is bringing in the system a lot of the marginal voices who in fact are representing the future, but who are right now considering all that as more or less useful because it doesn't represent them, it doesn't represent their aspirations. And it's feasible. It's very concrete. It's not rocket science. It's really a question of being bold in terms of making public investment to represent more the fabric of your society.
Thank you. And we've almost come to the end of our conversation. There's a question asking for me to repeat the scholar that I mentioned earlier. So that's Ellen, E-L-L-E-N, and Dissanayake, D-I-S-S-A-N-A-Y-A-K. I would type it in, but I'm not very good at talking and typing at the same time. So we're going to come to conclusion. I'm going to ask you one last question, and apologies to those audience members who I am not taking questions from now because we're going to run out of time. I'll try and join my question up with the last one there. Whose responsibility is it to frame and drive change, and what really needs to happen to get that multi-stakeholder pan-community buy-in? And then there's a question here around new skills that creatives and professionals in the cultural field will need in order to develop in the reality of COVID and past it. Any final points from panelists on those questions? Clive.
Yeah, I guess it's partly my responsibility. It's what I get paid to do. So I need to make sure that I do my job properly. And I take that responsibility seriously. I don't underestimate the scope of the task, but the more people we can get who are thinking clearly and progressively, the better it's going to be for all of us.
Anybody else on that point? Does anybody want to? Joanna, thank you.
I think Sharon said something earlier, which I completely agree with also, that this is, I think it was Sharon, somebody said it was about top down and bottom up. It has to be, we have, and Simon as well, talking about listening to new voices. So, of course, you have to, the point about the current gatekeepers are sometimes the people who are stopping others from coming through the gates. So we have to address that. But all of us who care passionately and who know profoundly in our guts what culture does and contributes to society, for all of us who do that, it's our job. We all have to drive change. And as I do believe there is an opportunity right now.
Thank you. And we've got a question, which I'm not going to ask you to answer, but the person who's asking the question, how can HEI's active research benefit the cultural sector, do contact us on our emails at the university. I'm sure any of our respective colleagues involved in active research engaged with the cultural sector would be happy to answer that question beyond this meeting. So thank you very much, everyone. We've got to the end of our session today. I want to thank all of our panelists for such an incredible conversation. Thank you for being so generous with your time and for being so thoughtful and open and honest. Thank you to our BSL interpreters, Donna and Greg. It's been terrific to have you with us again this evening. Good night, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.